Well, hello and welcome back to the channel. If you don't know me, my name is Simon and I'm a professional mediator. In this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the ways that we can develop emotional intelligence, specifically thinking about how that relates to conflict. I'll explain a particular framework that I often use when I'm delivering conflict resolution training. And people often come to this kind of workshop that I run looking for options that they can use to support themselves in this area, to support their growth, I guess. They realize that maybe they're a little bit overreactive, or for some people, I think it's just that they're very conflict avoidant or something like that. And they're wanting to be able to do things differently. And I actually think they're on the right track. They've realized that what they need is some type of emotional maturity. Do you know what I mean? Emotional development, emotional growth, an increased emotional capacity to manage your emotions. But like, what do we mean by that word, manage our emotions? Like, we've all probably got a slightly different idea about what that means. Most of us, I think, would think about it as controlling. We want to control the emotions and probably avoid some of the negative emotions that we're experiencing in some circumstances. But in other situations, what we mean by emotional intelligence is actually more about how we manage other people's reactions. Like, some people say they take things very personally, or they feel overwhelmed when they're in the middle of conflict, or they find it hard to stand up for themselves because they're quite worried about how the other person thinks about them. You know, a lot of the time these people naturally become people pleasers over time because they are actively almost micromanaging other people's perceptions of them at any one given moment. And of course that can be very exhausting over time. So it's a very common topic that comes up, and I thought it would be a useful thing to focus on for the video today. I thought that it might be helpful, though, to begin with a bit of a quote. This is from an author, Young Pueblo, who I really like all of their books, actually. This particular quote, I think it's from one of the books called Insight, and I actually had it around my office earlier today, but I'm not sure where I put it. The books that he's written, they're all these absolutely lovely, prosy, poetry type of captions, a bit like this one. So for me, though, this is often, I think, encapsulating what most people think of when they talk about emotional intelligence. He says, your immediate reaction does not tell who you are. It's how you decide to respond after the reaction that gives you real insight into how much you've grown. Your first reaction is your past. Your intentional response is your present. I wonder, how does that sit with you? Does that resonate? Is that sort of what you're aiming for as you think about what your goal is around emotional intelligence? We can't stop that reaction. It's funny, even I was watching Mel Gibson on Joe Rogan the other day, and he was saying, you're not responsible for your first thought. I think that's what he said. You're responsible for your second thought and your first action, or something along those lines. That initial reaction that we have, it really is just the way that we're wired. You know, our brain is sitting there in our head and it can't sense anything that's going on out here in the world. So at any one given moment, our brain is trying to make sense of what's happening, and it's doing its best to anticipate what we might need to do next. There's another book I was reading this morning as well. It's called How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett. An incredibly useful book to explain the way that we have these emotions effectively is that they're metabolic regulators. Like, our brain uses our emotions to get us ready for the thing that we might need to do next. So anger might be in situations where there's a boundary being crossed and we need to stand up for ourselves, or we're being physically threatened and we might need to fight or flight. All of the different emotions that we have effectively serve to influence our behavior. Like, disgust at the smell of something might be an indication that I shouldn't eat it. The skin crawling feeling that I have talking to someone might be an indication that I shouldn't date them. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's almost like our brain, this is a situation where historically this has been a threat. So when we're in new kind of situations, we're always going to have that kind of reaction. And it's really about the way that our brain has learned to make sense of the world. Now, this will be a combination of upbringing as well as biological factors too. But ultimately, at any one point, like right now, I've got this particular hardwiring that my brain has in terms of the way that my system of perception works and the way that it interacts with my memories to predict what I'll need to do next. So for me these days, I'm not as nervous when I'm going to stand up the front and talk to people, like that's my job, that's what I do, or running a challenging workplace mediation. Like, I can sit down with two people who loathe each other, whereas for the line managers and operational managers in those organizations, a lot of the time that's immensely stressful for them. But I've learned that I can get through that kind of situation and I'll be okay, and different options that I've got for managing it and this kind of thing. But early on, it was completely nerve-wracking. So for you, I wonder if that's what you're talking about when you think about emotional intelligence. Maybe it's the intensity of that initial reaction, or is it you're wanting to somehow pry a little bit of space between that reaction and then for some people, the behavior that follows, it's almost like it's automatic. So that, I think, is another sign of that emotional maturity developing, is that we pry a little bit of daylight between that initial thing that we feel, that initial thought that we have, that initial compulsive behavior that we have, that we experience, and what we actually end up doing. So for me, I tend to think about the development of emotional intelligence as happening over these 4 different steps. And the way that it works is that we start up here on the top left. Well, that's the world's worst number 1. We start up here at the first one here. And so we're looking at self-awareness. For me, I think once we become aware of that kind of reaction, then we have options for managing it, but we have to become aware of it. Even in management literature, there's lots of sayings like what you don't measure, you can't control, this kind of thing. So for you, if your goal is to manage your emotions, then the first step will be that you begin to measure it. You have to notice it. You have to become aware of what those initial reactions look like. I've talked in other videos about those 5 aspects of you, like your thoughts, your story that you tell yourself, the meaning that you're making, the automatic assumptions, etc. You've got your feelings. This is where the emotional intelligence kind of stuff comes into it. And then connected to that, you've got your perception, what you're noticing and paying attention to, what you're doing, your behavior. And then finally, your body, your physical body, like, your heart rate, blood pressure, sugar, all that kind of stuff. So when we have that initial reaction that Jung Pueblo talks about there, it's a pen name that he uses, so it's not his real name, but I'll refer to them like that. We have that reaction, all 5 of these different aspects probably change in us. Like your heart rate will increase, your body will change, you'll have compulsive behaviors that you want to do, your fists will clench on your side or your hands will shake or something. Your perception will adjust, you'll focus more on the problem, you'll catastrophize, etc. You'll have all of the emotional reactions that we're talking about, but your thoughts will also change. So as you're developing self-awareness, you do want to focus on the feelings part of it, but it's also going to be connected to these other 4 aspects as well. The next step, I think, for a lot of people who are looking to develop emotional intelligence is that this then leads to increased capacity for self-regulation. This often is what we go to next. So we have self-awareness and then that leads to self-regulation, of course. So that could be simple things in the moment, like deep breathing activities, really focusing on the exhale, letting your breath all of the way out, using your nose rather than your mouth, or adjusting your perception, for example, mindfulness activities like paying attention, wiggle your toes and feel the feeling of your socks in your shoes, or feel the tongue in your mouth or the temperature of the air in the room that you're in. We're adjusting our perception to focus on something else other than this thing, which in the moment, our brain is thinking that this is the number 1 threat that we need to deal with. This jerk that's in our face and trying to accuse us of something that's not true. Really, we could look at self-regulation in any of these 5 different areas. We could self-regulate our thoughts, we could self-regulate our emotions, we could self-regulate our perception, we could self-regulate our behavior. Just slow down. Don't do the thing that you're wanting to do. Although that conflict is in your head, instead of writing the email, go and clean the kitchen or go for a walk around the building or something else, or do things that change your body, like having something to eat, having a rest, having a shower, washing your face, all of these kind of options. So different strategies will work for you in terms of that self-regulation step, but it's very unlikely that you are going to be effective at regulating your emotions if you're not aware of what's actually happening for us. So that brings us back to the number 1. And I think for a lot of people, they bounce between these 2, probably for the first couple of years in terms of their career. Awareness of a new trigger, a new cue that causes me stress, developing different options that I can use for managing it. And then once that one's under control, we kind of look at the next situation that we need to manage. And for a lot of people, there's a parallel, because as you get promoted or get more experience and take on more senior roles within your job, you're also probably looking at more intense triggers for conflict and stress. So your ability to deal with stress kind of increases at the same time as the demands and challenges that you're dealing with increase as well. The third step often is an awareness of others. Once we can understand that a lot of our own emotional reaction is because of that perception of threat, then it gives us information about what we can do to de-escalate the other person, using a low tone, low volume, slow speed, open body language, focus towards them, like letting them know that we're paying attention, hands that are visible, relatively neutral facial expressions. All of these kind of things will influence the other person to calm down, because we understand that what gets them worked up is this sense of threat. It's this sense of pressure, a sense of perceived criticism, sense of not being safe, not standing on solid ground, like all of a sudden something changing and they don't know what's going on. So it's a level of uncertainty and unpredictability that causes them to escalate. We become more about what's likely to trigger and affect them because we're aware of how we get affected. This is another challenge when I'm doing conflict resolution training workshops, is that sometimes I'll have very smart people in the room and I'm saying to them, look, what do you need to do to de-escalate your staff member who's much more erratic and volatile? And they'll talk to me about these kind of academic textbook kind of options, like I'll structure the conversation like this or whatever. And it's almost like they don't get it. And I think maybe they are a very stable kind of person, probably because they've been in some much more intense crises than the other staff that they're trying to support. But they have trouble putting themselves in the other person's shoes, which means that it's very difficult for them to know how to support them best. So then the final step is we have this positive influence. I should say that's number 3 and that's number 4. We gradually become aware of ourselves. We then find better options for regulating our own emotions. From there, we develop an awareness, a bit of a mind map or a mental map, like Dan Siegel talks about, of what the other person might be experiencing, what's going on for them. And then this leads to an increased ability in, if it's de-escalation, that would be the goal. In other situations, it might be just controlling them better. If they're all over the shop and they're wasting your time, it might be that you're more convincing, you can get them to listen to you, and that's what you're aiming for. But you'll still need to follow those 4 kind of steps, I think, as you consider the different strategies that are going to work best for you. I've made a big mess of that slide. How does that sit with you? Does that make sense? And does that tend to match the way that you think about all of this kind of stuff? So as I mentioned, those 5 different aspects of self, we could use this at any of these different layers, like the self-awareness, the self-regulation, the awareness of others, and the positive influence. As we become escalated, our thoughts will change. The same would happen for the other person, their feelings, their perception, what they're noticing, their behavior, and their physical body. And so the things that cause them to escalate are going to be the same things that cause us to escalate, and vice versa. If our goal is to calm them down, then we can intervene at all 5 of these different options. That has been incredibly helpful for me because it's really expanded the different options set that I can draw from as I'm dealing with any particular problem. Like my son who's angry and erratic, I could intervene at any of these different levels. I could explain to him the reasons why. I could attend to a bit of empathy and acknowledge what's going on for him. I could adjust his perception and get him to wear his watch and check the time or something. I could change his behavior and just get him to take a few deep breaths or stop what he's saying, or I could just stop interrupting him and let him speak or something, or I could suggest he has something to eat or has a rest or slows down a bit or something like that. So I have all of these different avenues almost to deal with the conflict, which for me it's been quite an empowering thing to sort of think about and realize some of these different aspects. So what a way to finish, except for another quote by the great Jung Pueblo. To see your hidden patterns, you need to intentionally build self-awareness, question your perception, build a compassionate and honest inner dialogue, dig deeper into what your real motivations are, and have the humility to know you can learn more. Self-awareness, combined with action, opens the door to real change. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that it has been helpful for you. If you've got feedback, a question, a different idea for a topic, a conflict case study that you would like me to deal with in a future episode on the podcast or on the YouTube channel, please drop it down in the comments below. If it has been helpful, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd consider pressing like, and if you'd like additional resources for dealing with conflict, whether that's connected to workplace situations or conflict outside of work, please consider pressing subscribe. Otherwise, hopefully see you again in a future video. Thanks again. Bye for now.